We're currently in the 8th generation of home video game consoles, encompassing the PS4, Xbox One, and the Nintendo Switch and Wii U. The first video game consoles as we know them today started in the mid-70s with the Magnavox Odyssey 100, 200, and of course, Pong. Modern home video games started with the 3rd generation of consoles, the NES, Sega SG-1000, and later the Master System. As I mentioned in my last video, the NES helped bring the home gaming industry back from the brink of collapse. This was the first major shift for home gaming, as it suddenly wasn't a dirty word anymore. In the United States, the NES was originally marketed as a toy more than a video game console because savvy consumers were still gun-shy after being burned by the Atari and other early home consoles. That's why we ended up with things like Rob and the Power Glove. Video games were here to stay. Today we're going to talk about the 5th generation consoles, the N64, Sony PlayStation, and Sega Saturn. These consoles marked the next significant shift for home gaming. Consoles were now powerful enough to consistently render 3D environments. We'd seen the inklings of this leading into this generation, but most 3D games weren't truly 3D. Devs used a lot of clever tricks to create the illusion. Games like Super Mario Kart and Pilot Wings used sprite scaling to create the illusion of 3D, while games like Star Fox used primitive 3D modeling with the help of a second processor chip inside the cartridge. With the advent of new hardware, no longer were they restricted to the 2D planes and pixel art of the past. At the time, these games were an incredible revolution and remain an important touchstone in gaming history. Through the lens of hindsight, though, these games suck. Just so we're clear, this isn't going to be a diatribe about games that we know are terrible. Superman 64 is objectively a shitty game. Castlevania 64 is objectively a shitty game. Every person, every industry experiences growing pains. Just like you and I had awkward teenage years, so too did video games. They're no longer the precocious, lovable scamps of the NES and the Super NES, but they had yet to fully blossom into the beautiful, stunning games we see today. Just like with our own teenage years, the 5th generation consoles are clumsy, weird looking. Their voices are changing. They probably smell bad. They're starting to look at boys and girls in a different way. Sorry, I got off track there. My point is that this was a turning point for the way we played video games. Just like you and I, as we were growing into our adult bodies, video games were also growing into their adult bodies, and they had no idea what to do with them. So let's start with the obvious criticism. These games are ugly. Let's take a look at Ocarina of Time. Ocarina of Time was a revolution. We'd had 3D games before, but nothing quite like this. Ocarina of Time was one of the first games to use lock-on targeting for 3D combat, a system which is still used to this day. And to their credit, they really did push the system to its upper limits of what it was capable of doing. The developers of these titles were doing the best they had with the tools they had available, but unfortunately that meant making a lot of compromises, and in some cases that meant using sprites and pre-rendered backgrounds instead of rendered objects, such as with Final Fantasy VII and Mario Kart 64. Often this meant only having so much of the game loaded at a time, and everything else was obscured by fog or low draw distance. You see this with Ocarina of Time, but sometimes games use that to their own advantage to create atmosphere. Silent Hill and Parasite Eve are great examples of this, as the low draw distance makes objects easier to obscure, keeping the suspense high. Nintendo would later release the expansion pack, increasing the system's RAM from 4 MB to 8 MB, allowing for an overall increase in quality for supported games. Only 3 games, Donkey Kong 64, Majora's Mask, and Perfect Dark, required the accessory to play, with a few dozen more games including support. The majority of these games receive an upgraded resolution with the accessory, up to a whopping 640 by 480, increased frame rate, increased textural quality, and in some cases up to 4-player multiplayer. But as the saying goes, this is just polishing a turd. Some developers were savvy enough to dodge the obvious pitfalls of diving headfirst into 3D gaming and stuck with what was working. Symphony of the Night is widely regarded as one of the best games of its kind, and with good reason. The art is beautiful, the gameplay is tight, the music is breathtaking, the voice acting...
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets!
Well, it certainly is a thing, isn't it? This is another one of the big issues that early 3D games ran into. The vast majority of the voice acting sounds like the development team's younger brother who once played a tree in high school played at it. Take, for example, Resident Evil. This is another inarguably iconic game, creating an entire franchise that is still going to this day, as well as being the standard bearer for survival horror as we know it. RE is incredibly effective at using the tools they had to create the thrilling, tense game, but man does that voice acting take you out of it.
Well, I'm sorry, but he's probably...
No.
RE suffers in other ways, but this is perhaps the most glaring. Fortunately for Resident Evil, and a lot of other games I've already talked about, we're in a golden age of remakes. We've already seen remakes of the first 3 RE games. So far, we've also seen remakes of Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, the first episode of the Final Fantasy VII remake, and countless others. Let's be clear though, these games aren't just getting remade because they look crummy and sound like Mrs. Johnson's 5th grade class acted them. The gameplay itself has a lot of issues. Up to this point, we were relegated to going left, right, up, and down. That's the way it was, and that was all we knew. Suddenly we had an entire new dimension to explore, and along with it came the follies of camera control. Nintendo's solution to this was the C buttons. Mario 64 blew my little 11-year-old mind the first time I played it. This was the Mario I knew, but suddenly he was jumping at the screen, throwing punches and shouting "Waha!" The camera in that game worked for what it was, but it was extremely limited in its capability. Due to the way the game is mapped, the camera could only swing left to right or zoom in and out. In some cases the camera was able to make an entire revolution, but usually was stuck to 3 or 4 preset positions. And I sure hope you like hearing this sound, because you're going to be hearing it a lot. Banjo-Kazooie has similar frustrations, with the limited functionality and grating sounds. The Zelda games were able to work around this with Z targeting, but that too is even more limiting. Now, twin joysticks are the standard, and 99% of the time camera controls are on the second joystick, giving full degree of movement. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well that's just the N64, just look at the controller on that thing, you'd have to be a mutant to hold it. Well, first of all, shut up. Second of all, the original PlayStation was even more limited. The N64 controller was so revolutionary because it was the first console controller with an analog joystick. The first PlayStation controllers lacked the twin joysticks we know and love today, so when the camera needed to be controlled, it was usually relegated to the shoulder buttons. Even when the DualShock was finally introduced, the idea of a second joystick was so foreign, it was either used poorly or not at all. Ape Escape was the first game on the PlayStation with DualShock support, and the right analog stick was used to swing your current item in the direction you push, with the camera still being relegated to the shoulder buttons. The Spyro Trilogy doesn't even use the second analog stick, despite fully supporting the controller. Once again, this was a shortcoming that was resolved in the remake, as well as giving the game a fresh coat of paint. Of course, camera control wasn't the only gameplay issue. Sometimes controlling your character was an exercise in frustration. This is one of the things the N64 got right, which is why, despite the confusing design, I really do love the N64 controller. An analog stick meant 360-degree movement, and it's a wonder Sony didn't jump on that idea much sooner. As a result of Sony's controller design, many games used tank controls, meaning you had to push left or right on the D-pad to rotate in that direction, and pressing up and down to move forward to backward respectively. You know, like a tank. Despite the other problems the original Resident Evil games have, I think tank controls add to the atmosphere of the game. There's nothing scarier than trying to run from a blood-hungry fiend and having to turn all the way around before you're able to run away. There's a good chance you're not going to make it. Resident Evil was able to use this effectively, but games like Croc suffer as a result. Of course, Croc isn't exactly a fast-paced game, really even a great game, but having to turn your character to face the direction you want to move is pretty frustrating. The Tomb Raider games have slow plotting controls as well. When you're, raiding tombs, this isn't so bad, but the game also has light combat elements. I'm less forgiving on this one, since Tomb Raider isn't necessarily meant to be scary and intense the way Resident Evil is. Well, you could argue that this builds tension in the same way and makes your victory over angry dogs that much sweeter, but this is my video, so shut up. The N64 had its share of control problems as well. GoldenEye was yet another insanely ambitious game for the time, and without it we wouldn't have first-person shooters on consoles. Nowadays we take for granted just how intuitive it is to navigate 3D space using dual analog sticks, but in 1997 we weren't so lucky. As with most games, and as to the thesis of this video, devs were still figuring out what exactly all of this meant. The default controls had moving forward and backward, as well as turning left and right mapped to the analog stick, with strafing and camera tilting mapped to the C buttons. The standard now is to have forward and backward movement and strafing on the left stick, with turning and looking mapped to the right. It feels a lot more natural, as all direct movement and all indirect movement is separated in 2 different places. Now you can still change the controls to be more analogous to modern shooters, but at the time there was no standard. It's similar to the way WASD was an option in PC shooters as long as they have existed, but Half-Life was the first game to make it the default setting. Now, it sounds completely batty to even think of mapping your controls otherwise. Well, this is really the crux of this video. I refer to this generation as the awkward teenage years, because it really does feel like that. Remember how awful and unpleasant high school and middle school were? You were suddenly thrust into this new adult world, and you still had your stupid kid body. Recess was a thing of the past, and puberty was looming its ugly head, ready to ravage you inside and out. Nobody had any idea what we were doing, and we were all just trying our best, and making a lot of unpleasant mistakes along the way. This era of gaming is the same. Games were still used to their pixel bodies and had these new, exciting polygons to explore. There was no standard for any of this, and developers were doing their best to try to figure it out. By no means am I saying any of these are bad games. Blast Corps was a launch title on the N64, and I still love it despite its many obvious flaws. The camera is limited in what it can do, it makes a horrendous sound, and the game is butt ugly. But man is it still fun to play. And a lot of these games are still a blast to play, and we've been lucky enough to get remakes of many of them. Mario 64 completely changed the way we think about platformers. Ocarina of Time made combat in 3D space fun and exciting. Resident Evil and Silent Hill pioneered an entire genre. Retrospectively, it's clear to see that most of these games have aged poorly for any number of reasons. Now sure, compared to modern games with higher budgets, more experience, and better technology, these games are gonna look bad. Comparing them to earlier games is where the flaws really show. 2D games were the wheelhouse of developers at the time. They knew what they were doing, they knew how to do it, and they knew how to make it shine. The fact is that the 5th generation console cycle had a lot of blemishes, but just like the awkward, geeky freshmen, they eventually blossomed into something spectacular. Without these games testing the waters and trying new things, we wouldn't be where we are today. 3D games were still in their infancy, and there was a lot to learn. There were stumbling blocks to overcome, and frankly, the technology wasn't quite there. That's why HD remakes exist. In general, that's a good thing. Not only does it allow a new generation of gamers to experience these would-be masterpieces, but it allows the developers to use new tools, new experience, and a new vision to make better versions of what the originals wanted to be. Now, of course, this isn't always the case, but that's a topic for another time. Well, that's all we have for this week. If you enjoyed this video, do please give it a like and leave your thoughts down below. And if you've got a friend who you think might enjoy this video, share the link and we'll keep the conversation going. Thank you as always for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Until then, keep playing.